The first missionary journey. Well, we're finally there, going through the adventures of Paul taking the gospel, the beginnings of taking it around the world. Well, to learn this story, you have to remember this story has a lot of activity, a lot of movement. So consequently, the storyboard's a little bit longer, but it's not difficult because there's not a lot of conversation and a list here, but you do have a lot of moving from one thing to the other. So let's just get started. Get your hands up and let's go through the whole thing. First of all, we have Barnabas and Saul being sent out with John Mark. Okay, do that with me. What is it? Barnabas and Saul being sent out with John Mark. Now, every time you have a hand gesture and you can't remember the next one, you have to go back and see how those connect to help remind you that this hand gesture right here will remind you of the next one. The way I do that is you have Barnabas and Saul being sent out, John Mark, and I just open this hand. Because this is when Saul becomes Paul. So let's just do it. At this point, when I do Paul, I'm going to put my hand behind my ear, but let's just do it again. Two men being sent out, Barnabas and Saul being sent out with John Mark. Paul to Saul. The governor wanted to hear the message, but there was a sorcerer who kept interrupting. You are an enemy of God. Be quiet. You're going blind. And then the governor again. But let's just back up before we go to the, let's just go to the whole thing. Barnabas, do it with me. Saul being sent out. John Mark. Saul, Paul. The governor wanted to hear. The agitator, the sorcerer. You are an enemy of God. Stop talking. You will go blind. Now the governor really wants to hear the message of God, and he receives the message of God, and Mark goes home. Now, I know there's a break between when he received the message of God and Mark goes home, but again, that's the next major thing. They leave the island, go to the mainland, and Mark goes home. So I have my hands moving. I have that he brings it up that he wants to hear. He receives the gospel, and I just keep this hand out here because and then Mark goes home. Now, I have it bouncing. Mark goes home, coming back up to the synagogue. This is my picture of a building right here. So, he wants to hear, he receives the gospel, Mark goes home, synagogue, come talk to us. Now, come talk to us, I'm moving back, so come talk to us. So Paul tells about the stories of Israel, pointing back, the stories of Israel, and the promise of God, and that Jesus fulfills that promise. Now, what I do at this point is that when I have Jesus fulfills the promise, I bring it right back down because the religious leaders crucified Jesus, buried him, and God raised him from the dead. So let's just back up. So we have John Mark. What is it? John Mark leaves, bounce up to the synagogue. Come speak to us. The stories of God, the stories of Israel, God's promise. Jesus fulfills that promise. They crucified him, buried him. God raised him from the dead. Jesus brings forgiveness of sins. Okay? Let's just back up. Let's go back to the beginning. I will go slow so you can do it with me and maybe a little ahead of me so that we get everything up to this point. Hopefully this flows one into the other. So let's just keep it moving and go through the whole thing. We have what? Barnabas and Saul being sent. John Mark. Saul, Paul. The governor wanted to hear. The agitator, the sorcerer. You are an enemy of God. Stop talking. You will go blind. Now the governor wants to hear and receives Christ. Mark goes home. Synagogue. Come talk to us. The history of Israel, the stories of Israel, God's promise. Jesus fulfills that promise. They crucified him, put him in the tomb. God raised him from the dead. Jesus is the Son of God, and he brings forgiveness of sins. Don't miss what God's doing for you. So you have forgiveness of sins. Don't miss what God's doing for you. Some heard and received the grace of God. Others says, come back next week so we can debate it or we can talk about it. But next week, big crowd of people. So that the Jews are jealous. This is my word for jealous. Actually, there's other signs for this too, but they're jealous. Let's just back up. Jesus Christ brings forgiveness of sins. Don't miss what God's doing for you. Some heard the message of Paul and received the grace of God. Others said, come back next week and we will talk about it. Big crowd next week, so the Jews are jealous. And Paul says, we went to you first. We gave the gospel to you first, and you refused it. Now the Gentiles are, you're not worthy of it. Okay, we went to you first. You refused it. Now you're not worthy. We will go to the Gentiles. They will hear. Gentiles were overjoyed at this, and they received the message of God. And the gospel spread throughout the entire area, and the Jews were furious. Okay, we got a lot of different things here. Let's just back up, making sure that that Jesus Christ brings forgiveness of sins. Don't miss what God's doing here. Some heard, received the grace of God. Others says, come back and we will talk about it. Next week, big amount of Jews, and they were jealous. The gospel was brought to you first. You refused it. You're not worthy. We will go to the Gentiles. They will hear. Gentiles were thrilled, received the message. The gospel spread throughout all of that area, which made the Jews furious. And they got the city leaders to persecute Paul and Barnabas. And they finally had to leave. But the Spirit of God filled the believers. And they had joy in their heart. Okay, let's go through the whole thing from start to finish. I'll go slow enough so that you can go ahead of me. Then review this several times. How's it start? Barnabas, Saul, sent forth with John Mark. Saul, Paul. The governor wanted to hear. The sorcerer kept interrupting them. You're an enemy of God. Stop talking. You'll be blind. Now the governor wants to hear. He receives the message. John Mark goes home. The others go to the synagogue. Talk to us. Stories of Israel, the promise of God. Jesus fulfilled this promise. They crucified him, put him in a tomb. God raised him from the dead. Jesus is the Son of God and brings forgiveness of sins. Don't miss what God's doing for you. Some heard and received the grace of God. Others said, come back next week. We will talk more about it. They were surprised at the huge crowd, became jealous. And we brought the gospel to you first. You refused it. You're not worthy. We'll go to the Gentiles. They will hear. Gentiles were thrilled and received the gospel. Gospel spread through that entire area. So the Jews were furious. Got the city officials to persecute Barnabas, Paul. They had to leave. The Spirit of God filled the people. Their hearts were full of joy. Go through that several times. Get it down. Tell the story several times. Remember the key? You've got to tell the story poorly. And then you do it again and again until finally 5 times, and you'll have this important story for the rest of your life. Well, I trust you're enjoying this, going through the Acts of the Apostles as we go through the mission story set. Well, the Lord bless.